All right, so a question that we get asked a lot is, should I build an app or a website for my startup?
It depends.
The short answer is that it depends. Obviously, there's a number of things that you have to consider and think about to make that decision. The easiest and most obvious thing to think about is what your budget is. So similar to if you ask me where do I want to live in the world or what kind of car do I want to drive, things that will quickly narrow that search down for me would be budget.
Rolls Royce and live in a hotel everywhere.
Pretty much, that's accurate. So what we've done is put together a bit of a checklist to help navigate these conversations that we've had with some of our clients who are at that stage where they can't afford to necessarily do an iOS app and an Android app and a website. So coming to a place where you can make those decisions and feel good about them and feel like you're educated enough that you can make that decision and feel confident and hopefully not cost your business too much time and money is really important. And also it helps you kind of create a framework that if you do want to talk to a development partner or someone who's going to be helping you with this, that you have a kind of a sense of what your requirements are and what sandbox you're playing in. Did I forget anything?
No, I think you're good.
Okay. So the first thing that I've already mentioned that you want to think about is figuring out what your budget is. So this is something that you actually want to have an internal conversation with people on your team and figure out, what is the budget that you're actually willing to allocate to this specific endeavor or project. So one of the things that I hear a lot is like, how much does an app cost, or I can make a website for this or that, or they compare against other startups that they've seen, what kind of costs and things that have been published. It's really important to kind of look at your own business and figure out what those requirements are and what you're working towards. As some loose parameters, you can take a look at the blog post that we posted just to give you an idea of what, based on your budget that you have, what you might be looking at in terms of building a website or a hybrid app, or whether it makes sense for you to go down the route of having both an iOS app, an Android app, and a website. So the next thing to think about is if you're looking for something that is cost effective for to get you to a point where you have an MVP, or are you looking for something that makes sense longer term for you as like a solution for building a business? This is really important when we talk to startups because some people are really just looking to build out an MVP to like take their idea, bring it to market and test and validate it, and then use that feedback that they get from people to help and improve the app and iterate. There's other companies that maybe are further along where they're actually looking for something that is longer term and they need an idea of like what would it cost long term to maintain whatever it is, whether it's the app or the website, like what would it cost to like staff a team, to maintain it, to be able to handle updates. So that's an important part when you're thinking of the budget is this something that you're trying to kind of get up and running as quickly as possible, or are you looking at a longer term solution and what that would cost? Which brings me to number 3. So how important is speed? So depending on what your business is and what you're trying to build, it might be more important for you to get to market faster and learn while you're actually out in market. If you're in a highly regulated industry or you have a lot of things to consider in terms of like operational procedures that you have to follow, maybe you need to take a little bit more time in getting to market, but it's more important that you have things buttoned down on your end before you actually go to market. So thinking about speed and where that fits into your priorities is actually really important. So the next thing is figuring out who, if you don't already know, but establishing the target audience that you have for either the app or the website. When you're a new company or a startup, this might be something that you maybe you have a loose idea, or it's something you guys have kind of tossed around internally. But it is sometimes a sticking point when we talk to companies about building an app or a website. If it is something that you haven't really narrowed down, it is important to kind of think about who your audience is, because right off the bat, if we're already talking about having budget parameters and constraints that you aren't able to reach necessarily anyone and everyone, if you can put some parameters down, it actually helps you narrow your focus a little bit and will help alleviate some of those ideas where if you do have like a features list, or you do have a bunch of things that you want to do, if you know exactly who it's for and who you're talking to, you can help narrow that down by knowing exactly who your audience is. And another just important thing to note here is that when you look at your audience and how your audience uses certain technologies, it's important to put your own personal bias aside. Something that I hear a lot from people are things like, I've never bought something from a mobile app before, or I've never bought online, or I've never given access to my location through an app. Those type of things are your own personal bias, and it doesn't necessarily reflect your target audience and how they feel about your app or your website and giving information, or how they want to use it, or how often they would use it. So it's important to just kind of look at your audience as your audience, and look at your use cases and what you like to do as your own personal opinions, and making sure that they don't kind of cloud each other and get in the way of one another when you're trying to make a business decision. So the next thing to consider is accessibility. This is something that I feel like out of the gate, sometimes people overlook it a little bit in terms of how different, depending on if this is a priority or not, how much this can change the amount of time and effort you're putting into the project. So if accessibility is super important, and you need to think about, the content and navigation and the clarity, and do multiple testing for multiple browsers, and looking at if you need any other accessibility tools to be involved, that's something that I would definitely say that you should start thinking about sooner than later. It's very hard for once you get down the path of having content established and mock-ups and things like that, and then someone brings up that accessibility is a priority. It's a lot harder to go back and figure that stuff out after. Another thing to think about when you're choosing between a website and an app is looking at how often you'll be doing updates. So something that we hear a lot as well is that people want to get to launch, or they want to get to the finish line, but often, and as we know, if you are launching an app or a website, that's often not the finish line. It can be the starting point in many cases. So think about how much you want to, or how often you might be updating content, how often you'll be updating it with new features, and think about what that process might be, and that might help sway your decision on how you'd like to build things out. A really important one to think about is we know how much people are using apps, and we know how much time people are spending on their favorite apps. But one thing that is kind of overlooked sometimes with startups is that the majority of the time that people are spending on apps aren't with random apps. They're with like Facebook, they're with the person's favorite apps that they use all the time. And once you actually have those on your phone, you're much more likely to obviously use them again and get a lot of use out of them. For startups, one of the biggest barriers that I would say that is overlooked is the cost to acquire a new mobile app customer. So when you're looking at creating a website, obviously you can look at having organic search and people finding you through just doing a simple Google search online. You can look at social, you can look at having content marketing and PR and all sorts of things driving to your site. A challenge that obviously we have with mobile app is just getting acquisition of new customers, which can be quite costly. So make sure that you think about that as part of it. When you're thinking about budget, don't just think of the cost to build it, but make sure that you have enough budget to actually get those new customers, because it can be a lot more expensive than you think, and it is not the case where if you just build an app, people will download it and use it. You definitely will want to make sure that you have a solid acquisition strategy to make sure that you have mobile app users. And then the last and final point to think about is what is the best and most user-friendly experience for your customers? So something to consider is that if your company and or your startup is really focused around like location awareness, if it's really important that you know where the person is, or if you're doing like small frequent transactions, it's probably makes a lot of sense for you to have a mobile app where those things are able to just pull directly from the app itself, and you're not having the customer kind of add those things in over time. Thinking of the last point of really thinking about is what's the best thing to do, not necessarily just for your business and your wallet and those things, but just from a human level of what will your customers enjoy the most, what makes it easiest for them, what's the best experience for them. And hopefully with those kind of 8 points, you have an idea now of what direction you're leaning towards. If you think that a website might be the way to go, if you think maybe it's a mobile app, or maybe you think that you need both. If you feel like maybe you didn't have the clarity you wanted on some of these questions, it's a good time to go back, think about them, make sure you know who you're talking to, make sure you know what you want to accomplish, and do those things before you kind of dive in and start building something out, because it will be a lot more expensive and take a lot more time if you try to do it later down the road. So I hope that was helpful, and if you have any other questions that you'd like us to answer, feel free to send me a message and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks. That sounded like I was leaving a voicemail. Okay, that's it. Bye.